The Ivory Ascendancy did not arrive at the Kesh divide so much as unfold into it, the way a blade unfolds from a sleeve. One moment the space above the amber gas giant held nothing but the ordinary traffic of a frontier crossing, or barges, a hospital tender, 3 battered human warships riding station-keeping near the fuel platforms. The next moment the stars on the far side of the giant simply went out, blotted by hulls so vast and so pale that the sensors first read them as a moon that had wandered off its orbit. There were 40 of them, 40 ceramic white dreadnoughts, each one longer than a city, arranged in the perfect nested crescents the Vol used for their reckonings. They did not rush. They did not maneuver. They slid into position with the unhurried certainty of an executioner mounting the scaffold in front of a crowd that has already been made to kneel. And their arrival threw a shadow across the human platforms, so total that the automatic lamps flickered on across 3 stations, as though a sudden night had fallen. On the bridge of the Terran warship Perihelion, the collision alarm sang once and then fell silent, because there was nothing to collide with yet, and the computer had decided, in its blunt machine way, that whatever this was exceeded the vocabulary of an alarm. "Contact," the sensor officer said, and her voice cracked on the single word. "Contact, contact, Captain. I have 40 capital signatures, Ascendancy configuration, weapons hot. They're already inside minimum burn range." They didn't approach, they were just here. Captain Sable Reyes did not stand up from the command chair. That was the first thing the bridge crew noticed, and later, when they told the story in 100 wardrooms across 100 worlds, it was always the first thing they mentioned. Their captain did not stand. She kept one boot hooked under the console rail, the way a woman keeps her seat on a boat when the water gets rough, and she looked at the pale wall of hulls filling the forward screen the way another person might look at weather. She was 29 years old. She had a face that still surprised people who expected a legend to be older, sharp jaw, a scar like a comma at the corner of her mouth, dark eyes set a little too calm for the situation. Her hair was cropped short and going prematurely silver at the temples, which was the only part of her that seemed to have aged at the rate the galaxy had tried to age her. She wore the plain gray of the Free Fleet with no rank braid, because the Free Fleet had voted years ago that rank was a thing you carried in how the crew looked at you, and not a thing you sewed onto a sleeve. "Hold station," she said. "Don't warm the guns, don't so much as blink hard." "Captain, they want us to flinch first." Reyes's voice was quiet and even, pitched to carry no farther than the bridge. "Everything about this is theater, the dark, the size, the way they came in without a burn just to make us feel our own hearts stop. If we twitch, we've given them the first line of the play." "Hold." The forward screen brightened. A transmission was forcing its way into every human system in the divide at once. Not a request to open a channel, but a seizure of one. The Ascendancy's way of reminding a lesser people that their instruments belonged to their betters whenever their betters chose to use them. The bridge lights dimmed as the ship diverted power to reject the intrusion, failed, and gave up. Across the frontier, on the barges and the tender and the mining platforms and the 3 warships, the same face appeared on every screen that could hold an image. It was a Vol face, and the Vol were beautiful in the way that certain deep-sea things are beautiful, symmetry stretched to the edge of wrongness. The skin was the color of old ivory piano keys, faintly translucent, so that the fine architecture of the skull showed through at the temples. The eyes were large and lightless, without any white to them, set in a face that had been bred across 10,000 years of dynastic patience to express exactly one thing, the certainty of precedence. Behind the face, out of focus, rose the tiered gallery of a Vol command deck, ringed with retainers in graduated shades of white, each shade a rank a life spent measuring itself against the lives above and below. "People of the human vagrancy," the Vol said, and the translation matrix rendered the voice as something cool and resonant and unbothered, a voice accustomed to being the last one heard. "I am High Executor Oswar Vale, third of the Ivory Precedents, keeper of the reckoning hand of the sovereign conquered. You will attend and you will not speak, for what happens now is not a negotiation. It is a sentence." The bridge crew of the perihelion did not move. On the fuel platforms, 1,000 civilian workers stopped where they stood. "For 11 of your years," Vale continued, "the human diaspora has spread along the edges of ordered space like damp through a wall. You settle where you are not invited. You trade in what is not yours to trade. You have been warned in the proper forms at the proper tiers, and you have answered with the noise your kind mistakes for cleverness. That indulgence is ended. The conquered has weighed your species and found it to be a disorder. The Ivory Ascendancy does not tolerate disorder at its borders. It corrects it." He let a silence open, and the silence was engineered as carefully as the ship's. It was long enough for a human heart to fill it with everything it feared. "Your so-called free fleet," Vale said, "will surrender itself entire. Every vessel that flies the human mark will power down its drives, void its magazines, and open its holds to boarding by the close of this local rotation. Your crews will be inducted into the lowest tier of Ascendancy service, which is to say, they will be property, and they will be grateful, because property does not starve. Your outer settlements will be dispersed, and their populations relocated to labor where labor is needed. Your homeworld's independence is, as of this transmission, a historical curiosity." Somewhere on the bridge, the navigation officer made a small sound, quickly swallowed. "I understand," Vale went on, and now something entered the cool voice that had not been there before, something that took pleasure in itself, the way a man's voice changes when he arrives at the part of the story he has been waiting to tell. "That your kind clings to the idea of resistance the way a drowning animal clings to the thing that is drowning it. So I will be generous. I will remind you of what resistance purchases. Some of you will remember a ship, a survey vessel, the Meridian." Reyes's expression did not change, but her hand resting on the arm of the command chair went very still, not tense, not clenched, simply arrested, the way a clock stops. "11 years ago," said the High Executor, "that ship crossed a boundary it had been told not to cross. It was a small thing, an ugly little vessel of scrap and welded plate, crewed by fewer than 60 of your kind. The Ascendancy could have vaporized it between one breath and the next, but the reckoning is not vaporization. The reckoning is instruction. So the Meridian was taken, and its drives were cut, and it was left, whole, intact, its crew alive within it, to hang in the dark at the edge of the Vol shipping lanes, a warning strung up where every passing vessel of every lesser species would see it and understand. It was not permitted to die quickly. It was permitted to be seen. That humans is the reckoning. That is what your defiance buys, and that, the black eyes seemed to find the perihelion specifically across all the ships and platforms as if the Executor already knew which screen mattered, is what waits for your free fleet now, multiplied by every hull you were foolish enough to build. Submit and be property. Refuse and be an example. You have until the close of the rotation. The Ascendancy has spoken. There will be no reply worth hearing." The transmission held his face a moment longer, so that its stillness could sink into every human watching, and then it cut, and the screens returned to the pale 40 crescents hanging in the murdered starlight. For 3 full seconds, the bridge of the perihelion was so quiet that the crew could hear the coolant tick in the walls. The navigation officer, a young man named Petro who had been in the fleet for 2 years and had never once seen his captain frightened, turned in his seat because he needed, in that moment, to see her face. He needed to know what a person was supposed to do when a god read out your death and then told you it wasn't even worth the trouble of hating you. Captain Sable Reyes was smiling. It was not the brittle smile of a person keeping a brave face. Petro had seen those, he had warned them. This was something else. It started at the corner of her mouth, at the little comma-shaped scar, and it spread slow and unhurried and entirely genuine. And then her shoulders began to shake, And then, God help them all, in the shadow of 40 dreadnoughts, with the clock already running on the end of the human species, Captain Reyes put her head back against the command chair and laughed. It was not a mad laugh. That was the thing that unsettled the bridge more than anything the High Executor had said. If she had gone mad, they could have understood it. Madness was a reasonable response to what they had just heard. But this was a warm sound, low and delighted, the laugh of a person who has just heard the punchline of a very long joke and found that it was even better than she'd hoped. She laughed the way you laugh when an old rival walks into a room having just made, in front of everyone, the single mistake you have spent years praying he would make. "Captain," Petro said. Reyes lifted a hand. "Wait," the gesture said. "Give me a moment," and wiped the corner of one eye, and when she had her breath back she looked at the 40 crescents on the screen with an expression the crew would spend the rest of their lives trying to describe. Fondness. Actual fondness. "The meridian," she said softly, mostly to herself. "He led with the meridian, he led with it." She shook her head and the last of the laughter went out of her in a long, satisfied breath. 11 years. Do you know, I used to lie awake wondering how he'd open, what he'd say. Whether he'd remember it at all or whether we were just one more rope to him, one more thing to hang up and forget. And he opened with the meridian. She laughed again, once quiet. He remembers. He's proud of it. He kept it like a trophy in his mouth. The bridge crew exchanged glances. None of them understood yet. The censor officer, whose name was Dahl, spoke carefully, the way you speak to someone standing on a ledge. "Captain, that ship, the one he described, the one they hung up in the dark." "Yes," Reyes said. "You were on it." "I was on it." Reyes finally, unhurriedly, unhooked her boot from the rail and stood, and something in the way she rose made every head on the bridge turn toward her, because she rose like a person for whom a very long wait had just ended. "I was 19 years old and I was the junior navigator, and I was the last one alive when the scavengers finally cut us down, and I spent 4 years living inside the corpse of that ship, learning everything the Vol are too proud to imagine we could learn." She smiled again, and this time there was steel behind it. "He thinks the meridian was a warning to us. He has no idea. The meridian was a school, and he just enrolled his entire fleet." She turned to the comm station. "Open a channel to the High Executor," she said. "Wide broadcast. Every band. I want every ship in that armada to hear this, and I want every subject world in listening range to hear it too. If he's going to make an example, let's make sure the whole neighborhood is watching." "Captain," the comms officer said, hesitating. "He said there'd be no reply worth hearing." Sable Reyes settled back into the command chair, laced her fingers together, and looked at the pale wall of hulls that had been sent to erase her species, and the last of her laughter shaped itself into something the crew would follow to the end of everything. "Then let's make it worth hearing," she said. "Open the channel." The channel took 4 seconds to open, and the Vol did not make it easy. To broadcast on Ascendancy frequencies without permission was, in the eyes of the precedents, roughly equivalent to a servant seizing the master's own voice and shouting through it. The perihelions' comms sweet-whined and strained against layered protocols designed to make exactly this impossible. And then, because humans had spent 11 years building instruments specifically to do rude things on other people's networks, it broke through, and Captain Reyes's face went out across 40 dreadnoughts and a dozen subject worlds, small and gray and entirely unafraid. But before we hear what she said, it is worth understanding why she laughed. It is worth going back to the school. The Meridian had been an ugly ship. Reyes had never pretended otherwise, not even in memory, where people are permitted to make their dead beautiful. It had been a survey hauler 40 years past its rating, a thing of patched plate and mismatched drive cells, crewed by 58 people who had all, in one way or another, run out of better places to be. Its captain had been a broad, weathered man named Halden Marsh, who was old enough to be Reyes's grandfather and treated her, from the first day, as though she were the only person aboard who might one day be worth the trouble of teaching. He had a low voice and enormous scarred hands, and an infuriating habit of answering a direct question with a slower question of his own, and Reyes at 19 had found him maddening, and had loved him without ever once saying so, in the way of the young. They had crossed the boundary by accident. That was the part the High Executor's version always left out. There had been no defiance in it, no grand human refusal to kneel. There had been a bad star chart, a coolant leak, and a decision to cut across the corner of a shipping lane to reach a station where they could make repairs. The Meridian had drifted maybe 40,000 kilometers into space the Vol considered theirs, and the Vol had come, and there had been no negotiation, because to the Ascendancy the size of the trespass was irrelevant. What mattered was the principle. What mattered was the reckoning. They cut the drives first. A single lance from a passing cruiser, surgical, contemptuous, and the Meridian went dark and cold and helpless in a heartbeat. Then a boarding party came aboard, not to take anything, not to interrogate anyone, simply to disable. They welded the airlocks. They shattered the long-range transmitter. They cut the fuel lines to the reactor so that the ship would keep just enough power to hold air and heat and light, and not one erg more, and then they left. They did not kill a single member of the crew. That was the cruelty of it, the refinement of it, the thing that took Reyes years to understand. Killing would have been mercy, and mercy was not instructive. The Vol left the Meridian whole, and adrift and alive, hung at a fixed point in the dark where the shipping lanes converged, so that every barge and liner and ore hauler of every lesser species that passed through would see, on their screens, the small dead-lit shape of a human ship that had crossed the Ascendancy and been left to demonstrate what that cost. They hung there for 130 days. Reyes did not talk about most of those days, not to anyone, not ever. But the shape of them was known to her crew the way the shape of a war is known to the children of the people who fought it. The food ran out on the 41st day. The crew died the way people die in a slow, cold dark, the old first, then the sick, then the ones who simply decided they were finished waiting. Halden Marsh gave his rations away one meal at a time to whoever was youngest and lasted longest of the adults because of it, and near the end, when there were 9 of them left, and then 5 and then 3, he spent what strength he had teaching. That was the thing about Marsh that Reyes carried like a coal in her chest for the rest of her life. He did not spend his last weeks cursing the Vol or praying or weeping. He spent them teaching the junior navigator how the boarding party had disabled the ship, because he had watched them do it through a maintenance camera, and he had understood, with the clarity of a dying man, that the way they had done it revealed something. "They're careful," he told her, in the thin voice the end had left him. They were wrapped in every blanket and cable sleeve on the ship, breath fogging, the 2 of them and one other now, in the warmest corner they could find. "You watch how careful they are, Sable. They didn't just blow the drive. They cut it clean. They preserved the hull. Everything they do it to a rule. And a people that does everything to a rule," he had to stop and breathe. "A people that does everything to a rule has a rule for everything, which means everything they'll ever do you can learn, you can predict. You just have to live long enough to study them." His scarred hand had found hers in the dark. "So you're going to live long enough. That's an order, navigator. That's the last one I've got in me. You live and you learn them, and you find the rule they don't know they're following. Every jailer's got one." He died on the 94th day. The other survivor, an engineer named Aqui, died on the 119th. Sable Reyes was alone on the Meridian for 11 days after that, 19 years old, surrounded by the people she had loved, keeping herself alive on protein paste scraped from the seams of empty containers and on the single unreasonable instruction of a dead man. On the 130th day, a scavenger crew found the Meridian. They were not Vol and not human, a rough consortium of frontier species who made their living picking apart the things the great powers left in the dark, and they had come to strip the famous hung ship for parts, because by then the Meridian was a known landmark, a story, a thing you could point your children at. They cut through the welded airlock expecting a tomb. They found, instead, a girl with a length of pipe in her hands and eyes like a cornered animal, who did not attack them and did not weep, but simply said, in the trade pigeon she had taught herself from the ship's dead language files, that they could have everything aboard except the navigation core and the maintenance logs, and that in exchange she wanted passage and no questions. She kept the logs were the school. Because here is what the Vol had never imagined a human could do. When they left the Meridian to hang, they left its systems intact, minimal power, but intact. And the boarding party's tools, the diagnostic pulses they'd used to find and cut the drive, had left echoes all through the ship's passive sensors. Vale's people were so certain of their superiority that it never occurred to them to wipe a dying ship's memory, because what could a corpse learn? So the Meridian, in its long hanging, had quietly recorded everything. The signature of Vol cutting lances. The command protocols the boarding party had used to override the airlocks. The maintenance handshake between the Vol cruiser and its own systems, captured in fragments as it sat nearby to confirm the kill. And most precious of all, the fold drive resonance of the cruiser itself, logged over hours as it held station. The exact harmonic signature of how a Vol warship folds space to move. For 4 years after the scavengers cut her down, Sable Reyes lived cheap and quiet on the frontier and did nothing, to any outside eye, but drift. She took work on haulers. She learned to fight, and then learned that fighting was rarely the answer. She found, one by one, the other human survivors and refugees and stubborn holdouts scattering ahead of the Ascendancy's slow tide, and she did not organize them, not at first. She listened. And in every spare hour she had, she studied the logs, and she taught herself to read the Vol the way Halden Marsh had told her to, not as gods, but as a machine made of rules, a magnificent, ancient, rigid machine that had grown so certain of its own perfection that it had stopped checking its own assumptions 10,000 years ago. She found the rule they didn't know they were following. It took her 4 years and then a 5th, and then 2 more of quiet, patient, unglamorous work convincing a scattered, quarrelsome, half-broken diaspora of human survivors that she was not mad. But she found it. And the beauty of it, the thing that made her laugh in the shadow of 40 dreadnoughts 11 years later, was that the rule was not a weakness the Vol could ever have hidden, because they did not know it was a weakness. It was woven into the very thing that made them strong. It was in the reckoning itself. That was why she laughed when High Executor Oswar Vale opened his sentence of death by boasting about the Meridian. He thought he was showing her the gallows. He had no idea he was showing her the classroom, and confessing, in front of 40 ships and a dozen worlds, that he still did not know what the school had taught. The channel opened. Her face went out across the armada. High Executor Oswar Vale, Reyes said, and her voice was pleasant, conversational, the voice of a woman greeting someone at a party she was very glad had shown up. Third of the Ivory Precedents, keeper of the reckoning, and so on. You said there'd be no reply worth hearing. I'm going to try to change your mind about that because I think you're going to find this reply extremely worth hearing. I only wish my captain had lived to give it to you himself. He'd have done it better. But he taught me, so I'll do my best. On the tiered command deck of the flagship Sanctity of Ordered Light, High Executor Vale did not move, and the retainers around him held themselves in the frozen, graduated stillness of a court that has just heard a lower creature use the personal name of a higher one without title, without permission, and worst of all, without fear. You're broadcasting, Vale said. It was not a question, and the coolness in his voice had gone slightly, imperceptibly brittle. You have seized Ascendancy channels to make noise before you die. How very like your kind. Make your noise then, human. It changes nothing. The rotation is running. The reckoning is prepared. I know it is, Reyes said warmly. That's rather the point. Tell me, Executor, do you know why I'm laughing? The question hung in the seized air of a dozen worlds. Do you know why I'm laughing? It is difficult to overstate how badly the question landed on the tiered command deck of the sanctity of ordered light. The Vol did not laugh. This was not a figure of speech or a cultural exaggeration. They physically did not, the mirthful reflex having been bred out of the precedents generations ago as a disorder of the lower tiers, a spasm of the unregulated. To the Vol, laughter was what water was to fire, the involuntary sound a mind made when it lost its grip on order. That a human should be laughing now, at this moment, with the scaffold built and the rope measured, did not read to High Executor Vale as courage. Courage he could have respected and crushed. It read as a malfunction, and a malfunction in a creature you have already sentenced is an itch you cannot reach. I did not ask why you are laughing, Vale said. I have no interest in the internal weather of a condemned animal. You laugh because you have gone mad. It is a mercy that you will not live long enough to feel it. See, that's what I'd think too in your seat, Reyes agreed easily. It's the reasonable explanation. The humans cornered, the humans outgunned 40-3, the humans' whole species is on the block, so the humans cracked. Tidy, fits the rules. And you do love a thing that fits the rules. She leaned forward slightly in the command chair, and on a dozen worlds, subject species who had lived their whole lives beneath the Ivory Ascendancy leaned toward their screens without quite knowing why. But I want you to notice something, Executor. I want you to notice that you've already told me two things you didn't mean to, and we've barely started talking. You are in no position to be told anything, still less to tell. First thing, Reyes went on, unbothered, ticking it off on one finger. You came here to make an example, not to win. You don't need to win, you outnumber us like a boot outnumbers an ant. You came to instruct. That's why you didn't just fire the moment you unfolded. You seized every channel you could reach and made a speech, because the point isn't 3 human ships, the point is the dozen subject worlds watching right now, learning what defiance costs. You need an audience, Executor. The reckoning doesn't work in the dark. That's the first thing you told me. She held up a second finger. Second thing, you led with the meridian. Out of 11 years of human trespass, out of 100 grievances you could have opened with, you reached back a decade and pulled out one specific ship, one specific hanging, and you served it up first because it's your favorite. It's the one you're proudest of. It's the purest expression of the reckoning you've ever staged, and you've been carrying it around in your mouth like a smooth stone for 11 years. Her voice stayed gentle. You just told me in front of your whole fleet that the meridian is the model, that whatever you're going to do to us, you're going to do it the way you did it to us. Slow, clean, instructive, preserved, an example left to hang. Something flickered across the perfect ivory face. Not fear. Vale had never in his life had cause to learn what fear felt like, but a first thin thread of the sensation that precedes fear in creatures unaccustomed to it. The sense of a conversation that is not going the way it was scripted. You imagine, Vale said slowly, that because you have guessed my methods, you have some advantage. You have guessed nothing. My methods are not secret. They are proclaimed. The reckoning is announced precisely so that lesser peoples may understand it and be corrected by it. There is no cleverness in reading a thing written in letters of fire across the sky. No, Reyes said. There isn't. That's exactly right, and it's the whole problem, and you still can't see it. She smiled. You do everything to a rule, Executor. Everything. It's the most magnificent thing about you, and it's the reason you're already finished. Because a people that does everything to a rule can be read like a clock. And a people that's certain, really, truly, 10,000 years certain, that no lesser creature could ever be worth studying, never once imagines that the lesser creatures have been reading the clock. For 11 years, cover to cover, learning exactly which gear turns which. On the fuel platforms and the barges, on the hospital tender packed with wounded human civilians who had spent the last several minutes preparing to die listened to their captain talk to a god, as if the god were a slow student, and something impossible began to move through them. It was not hope, quite. Hope was too fragile a word. It was the particular electricity of watching someone who is not afraid when they have every reason to be, and beginning to wonder what they know that you don't. High Executor Vale was not a stupid creature. No one rose to the third tier of the precedence by being stupid. The Ascendancy's internal politics were a millennia-long knife fight conducted entirely in etiquette, and Vale had survived them by being, in his way, brilliant. And so, precisely because he was not stupid, a cold calculation began somewhere behind the lightless eyes. The human was too calm. The calm was not the calm of madness. He had seen madness, and it did not track two arguments in sequence and count them off on its fingers. The calm was the calm of a creature that believed it held a card, which meant either it was bluffing to buy time, or it held a card. "You are stalling," Vale said, and gave a small gesture, and across 40 dreadnoughts targeting systems that had been merely warm went hot, and 40 crescents of ceramic white hull turned, with the slow inevitability of a tide, to bring their primary batteries to bear on the 3 human warships and the platforms behind them. You broadcast, you philosophize, you count your little insights on your fingers, because the rotation is running and you are trying to spend it in words. Perhaps you hope reinforcements come. They will not. Perhaps you hope I will grow bored and merely destroy you cleanly, sparing you the reckoning. I will not. You have made yourself too useful an example to waste. The battery's locked. So, let us test your cleverness, human. I am going to begin the reckoning. Not on your warships, on the platforms. The civilian platforms first, the slow way, so that your fleet may watch its own people hang in the dark and understand, at last, the price of your amusement. And you will laugh, I think, a little less when it is done. It was, everyone on the human side understood, not a bluff. The Vol did not bluff. Bluffing was a disorder of the lower tiers. Vale meant to do exactly what he said, in exactly the order he said it, and he was telling them first because telling them first was part of the instrument. That was the reckoning. Announce the rule. Apply the rule. Let the watching learn. And it was at that moment, the moment the batteries locked, the moment the platforms full of civilians came under the guns, the moment when a lesser commander would have broken, begged, or fired in doomed defiance, that Captain Sable Reyes did the thing her crew would tell their grandchildren about. She checked the time. It was such a small gesture, and such a human one, that the translation matrices on the subject worlds did not even have a convention for it. She glanced, unhurried, at the chronometer on her console, the way a woman glances at a clock when she is waiting for a kettle, and then she looked back up at High Executor Vale with something that was almost unbearably sympathy. "You're going to want to hold off on that," she said. "Not for our sake, for yours. Because if you fire on those platforms in the next 90 seconds, you're going to spend the rest of your very long life explaining to the Sovereign Conquered how you lost 40 capital ships to 3, in front of a dozen subject worlds, on a live broadcast you couldn't stop, because you were too proud to listen to an animal for a minute and a half." She spread her hands. 90 seconds, Executor. That's the whole ask. 90 seconds, and I'll tell you exactly why I'm laughing. And then you can decide whether you still want to begin the reckoning. I think you won't. But I'm a generous woman, so I'm going to let you choose. "You have nothing," Vale said, but he did not give the order. The batteries stayed locked and did not fire, and every Vol on the tiered deck understood the significance of that pause, and hated the human for having caused it. "You have 3 ships and a mouth." "I have 3 ships, a mouth, and 11 years of homework," Reyes said. "Would you like to know what I did with the homework? I'll make it quick. When your people hung the Meridian, they left it powered. Minimal, but powered. Enough to keep the passive sensors alive. And your boarding crews were so certain we were beneath studying that they never wiped a single system. So the Meridian recorded them, Executor. It recorded everything. The cutting lance signatures, the override protocols, and the fold drive harmonic of the cruiser that sat there confirming the kill, hours of it, clean as a bell." She let that land. "I have spent 11 years learning exactly how a Vol warship folds space. Not roughly, not in theory, precisely. The resonance, the gravitational baseline it needs, the assumptions it makes about the space around it. I know your fold drives better than your own engineers do, because your engineers have never once had to question them, and I have thought about nothing else for a decade. She smiled, and it was gentle, and it was terrible. You built 40 of the finest ships in the galaxy, and you brought them all here into a nice, tidy crescent to make an example. And you never once asked whether the example might be you. Enough, Vale said, and now, for the first time, the coolness cracked all the way through, and what came out from under it was not fear but affront, the ancient, bottomless outrage of a being who has just realized a lesser creature is not merely defying him but has been ahead of him the entire time. Enough. Begin the Kesh, Reyes said, not to Vale, but into her own ship's channel, one quiet word, the name of a woman on another human ship, spoken with the calm of a captain who has said this word in 100 rehearsals, and always known she would one day say it for real. Drop the millstone. 40,000 kilometers away, on the far side of the amber gas giant, in a place where the Vol sensors registered nothing but the ordinary lumpy gravity of a planet and its moons, something that had been very carefully pretending to be a small dead moon for the last 19 days stopped pretending. To understand what the millstone was, you have to understand what the Vol had never bothered to learn about humans, which is that humans came from a violent, cluttered, gravitationally filthy little corner of the galaxy, and had spent their entire spacefaring history learning to move through mess. The Vol homeworld orbited a serene old star in a swept-clean region of space, and their entire technology of movement, their glorious fold drives, the envy of 100 subject species, was built on an assumption so deep they had forgotten it was an assumption. That space is smooth. That when you fold it to travel, the local gravitational field is a calm, predictable sheet you can pleat like fine cloth. Their drives were exquisite and their drives were fragile, in the specific way that a master calligrapher's hand is fragile, perfect on smooth paper, useless on crumpled. Humans had noticed this. Reyes had noticed it, alone in the cold of the meridian, reading the fold harmonic of the cruiser that killed her crew, seeing in the numbers how narrow the tolerances were, how much the whole magnificent system depended on the space around it staying polite. And she had asked the question the Vol had never asked in 10,000 years, because it had never once needed to be asked. What happens to a Vol fold drive if the space isn't polite? If the gravitational baseline isn't a smooth sheet but a churning, screaming mess? The answer was that it locks. It cannot fold what it cannot predict. A Vol warship in badly disordered space is not destroyed. It is simply, suddenly, unable to jump. Pinned. A magnificent ship of the line reduced to whatever its ordinary engines could do, which, because the Vol had leaned so hard on folding for so long, was not much. They had built the finest sprinters in the galaxy and forgotten how to walk. The millstone was how you made space impolite. It had taken the Free Fleet 6 years and very nearly everything they had. It was not a weapon in any sense the Vol would recognize. It was a shepherded fragment of degenerate matter, a chunk of collapsed stellar core no larger than a cargo container but massing more than a mountain range, wrapped in a cage of humanity's ugliest, most desperate, most brilliant engineering. It bent space around itself the way a heavy man bends a hammock. And humans, who could not outbuild the Ascendancy and never would, had realized they did not need to. They only needed to bring a small piece of chaos to a fight the Vol had chosen, and let the Vol's own perfection do the rest. For 19 days it had drifted behind the gas giant, cloaked in the planet's own gravitational shadow, its horrific mass hidden inside the honest lumpiness of a real world, waiting for the Ascendancy to do what the Ascendancy always did, gather its ships into a tidy crescent to make an example, and hold that formation, because holding formation during a reckoning was the rule, and the Vol did everything to a rule. Drop the millstone, Reyes said. On the human tug Ardent Kesh, a woman named Imara Kesh, no relation to the divide that shared the sound of her name, a coincidence the crew had always found funny, cut the containment tethers and fired the release. And the millstone came out from behind the gas giant on a fast, flat, screaming trajectory. And as it came, its cage unfolded, and the mountain mass of collapsed matter stopped being hidden inside a planet's gravity and started being itself, loud in the open, 40,000 kilometers from the neat crescents of the Ivory Ascendancy. Space in that region stopped being polite. The Vol sensors, which measured gravity with an exquisite delicacy no human instrument could match, screamed. The calm, smooth sheet that 40-fold drives had been resting upon crumpled all at once, a gravitational tide surging out from the plunging millstone, and 40 of the finest ships in the galaxy discovered, in the same instant, that they could not fold. The jump fields they had been idling. Every warship holds its fold drive ready in a fight, the way a duelist keeps his weight on the balls of his feet, collapsed, unable to find a baseline stable enough to pleat. Alarms the Vol had not heard in living memory, alarms most crews had never heard outside a drill, went off across the Armada. Drive after drive tried to compensate, tried to find the smooth space it had been built to assume, and could not find it because the space was gone, churned into a mess by a piece of a dead star that humans had towed here and hidden for 19 patient days. The 40 crescents did not break. That was the thing. They could not run and they could not fold, and their formation, which had been the instrument of 1,000 reckonings, was now the shape of a trap, and they held it anyway for 3 or 4 crucial seconds because the order to hold had not been rescinded, and the Vol did everything, to a rule. That, Captain Reyes said pleasantly, into a channel a dozen worlds were watching, is why I'm laughing. On the tiered command deck of the sanctity of ordered light, chaos of a kind the precedents had no etiquette for was blooming, and High Executor Ossuar Vale stood at the center of it, and for one long moment the perfect ivory face showed the thing it had been bred for 10,000 years never to show. Not fear, even now, comprehension. The specific, total, sickening comprehension of a creature who has just understood that the entire shape of the last several minutes, the speech, the laughter, the 90 seconds, the 2 things he had said that he hadn't meant to, had not been a condemned animal's flailing. It had been a woman keeping him talking, keeping his fleet holding formation, keeping his guns aimed at platforms instead of at the thing behind the planet, for exactly as long as it took a mountain to arrive. "Fold us out," Vale said. "Fold us out, all tears disperse the—" "They can't, Executor," Reyes said gently. "I told you. I know your drives better than you do. There isn't a fold field in that whole fleet that can find a baseline right now, and there won't be until the millstone leaves, and the millstone is on a very slow, very lazy orbit that's going to keep churning this whole volume of space for the next several hours. You're not going anywhere. 40 of the finest ships ever built, and every one of them is stuck standing exactly where you so kindly arranged them. In a crescent facing us. She let that settle across a dozen worlds. You brought them here to make an example. I did tell you to ask whether the example might be you." What followed was not a battle in the way the Vol understood battles, which was to say it was not a reckoning. It was something the Ascendancy had not experienced in 1100 years, and had no institutional memory of, and therefore no doctrine for. It was a fight against an enemy that could move when they could not. Because the millstone did not only pin the Vol. That was the second half of the thing Reyes had built her whole strategy upon, the half that took the trap and turned it into a victory. Human ships were ugly. Human ships were built by a species that had grown up flying through asteroid belts and cometary debris and the churned gravity of crowded young systems, and human drives did not assume space was smooth. Human drives assumed space was trying to kill you, which, in the region around a newly dropped millstone, was correct. The 3 Free Fleet warships and the little tug, and even the lumbering fuel platforms could maneuver in the gravitational mess, clumsily, sickeningly, their crews strapped down and gray-faced against forces the artificial gravity could barely buffer. But they could move, and 40 dreadnoughts could not. All ships, Reyes said, and now the pleasant conversational warmth was gone, replaced by something flat and fast and absolutely certain, the voice of a woman who had planned this down to the second and now had only to execute it. You know the pattern. Drives and sensor spines only. Nobody goes for the hull, nobody goes for crew compartments. We are not the reckoning. Cut them and leave them. Go. They went, and the subject worlds watched, breathless, as 3 battered human warships peeled off their station-keeping and threw themselves at a wall of 40 motionless giants, dancing through gravitational surf that would have torn a Vol ship's fine architecture apart, and began, with surgical patience, to blind and lame the greatest armada the Ascendancy had ever assembled. A cutting lance from the perihelion, reverse-engineered over 11 years, from the very weapon the Vol had used to kill the Meridian, reached out and severed the fold drive housing of the nearest dreadnought clean, precise, exactly the way the Vol had once cut the Meridian, and the great white ship shuddered and went dark along its dorsal spine and hung there, whole, alive, harmless. Hung there in the dark. An example. The Vol fought back, of course. They were not helpless. A pinned dreadnought is still a fortress, and their point defense was fast and their gunners were disciplined, and space around the armada filled with a lattice of fire. The human ships took hits. The ardent Kesh, the little tug that had carried the millstone for 19 days and dropped it on the second, took a full battery salvo across her bow as she tried to clear the engagement zone, and Amara Kesh and her crew of 9 did not make it out, and their light went out among the giants, and Captain Reyes did not look away from it and did not pretend it had not cost what it cost. The Free Fleet had come into this with 3 warships, a tug, and a plan, and against 40 capital ships even a perfect plan is paid for in blood. But the arithmetic that had looked like suicide 10 minutes before had quietly, catastrophically for the Vol, inverted. 40 ships that cannot move against 3 that can is not 40 to 3. It is closer to the other way around, and every second that passed, another Vol fold drive went dark, another dreadnought became a cathedral pin to the spot, and the crescent that had been built to instruct the galaxy in the price of defiance became, on a live and unstoppable broadcast, a demonstration of something else entirely. High Executor Vale watched his fleet be cut down, not destroyed, cut down, the human's word, the human's mercy that was somehow worse than slaughter because it meant humiliation would be survived and remembered. And he did the thing that Reyes had known from 11 years of homework that he would eventually do. Because he did everything to a rule, and there was a rule for this too buried deep, the last rule of a reckoning that had gone wrong. If the instrument fails, break the instrument. Executor, his own weapons master said in the graduated white of the second tier, we cannot fold. But the flagship's primary lance still bears on the human platforms. We can still complete the... I know what we can still do, Vale said quietly. And on the perihelion, Sable Reyes saw the flagship's primary battery, the great spinal lance of the sanctity of ordered light, begin to glow with charge, and saw that it was not aimed at her warships. It was aimed exactly as he had promised at the fuel platforms, at the civilians, at the audience. Because if he could not make an example of the Free Fleet, High Executor Ossuar Vale would make one of the only thing he still could reach, the helpless. He would salt the victory. He would make certain that whatever the subject worlds learned today, they would also learn what it cost to make him learn it. It was spite, and it was doctrine, and in the Vol mind those two things had never been separate. Reyes had 11 seconds. She had known, planning this in the small hours over the course of years, that there might come a moment exactly like this one, the cornered god reaching for the hostages, and she had built for it, because the whole thing had never been about winning the fight. Winning the fight was the easy part. The hard part, the part Halden Marsh had died teaching her, was what you did after you'd won, when the losing god still had one hand free, and every reason to close it into a fist. "Kesh is gone," her tactical officer said, meaning the tug, meaning the 9 dead. "Captain, the flagship's charging, they're going to fire on the platforms, we can't reach them in time to—" "We're not going to reach them," Reyes said. "I'm going to talk to him." She opened the channel one more time, the channel a dozen worlds still watched, and her voice, when it came, had lost every trace of laughter, and what was underneath the laughter was the thing that had kept a 19-year-old alive for 130 days in the dark. "Asuar Vale, look at me. Before you fire that lance, you're going to want to look at me, and you're going to want to hear the one thing I brought all this way to say." The spinal lance of the sanctity of ordered light kept charging. On the tactical display, the weapon's power curve climbed toward its firing threshold, and the fuel platforms, 11 of them, packed with civilian workers and a hospital tender full of the wounded, sat at the end of that curve, unable to run, because they could no more fold out of the churned space than the Vol could. "I am looking at you," High Executor Vale said. His voice had gone very quiet and very controlled, and underneath the control was a thing that no Vol of the 3rd tier was ever supposed to feel, a thing Reyes recognized because she had spent 11 years learning to recognize it in a species that had no word for it. He was cornered and he knew it, and the only power he had left was the power to make the moment cost her something. "I am looking at you, human, and I want you to understand what you have done. You will win here. I have already lost the fleet. I am not a fool. I can read the same display you can, but you will not win clean. Before this is over, you will watch me burn 11 platforms full of your own kind out of the sky, and every world that is watching will learn that this is the price of your cleverness. That is the reckoning. It does not require me to survive it. It only requires that it be seen. The lance crossed 60%. You made your example of me. Now I make mine of them. Say your one thing, human. Say it quickly. It will not stop the lance." "It won't," Reyes agreed. "You're right. Words won't stop the lance." She was very still in the command chair now, and her crew, who had followed her into this on faith, watched her hands move over her console in a sequence none of them recognized, small and precise and unhurried. "Here's my one thing, Asuar. Are you listening? Here it is. When your people hung the Meridian, when they cut her drives and welded her doors and left 58 human beings to die slow in the dark, so the galaxy could watch, do you know what they didn't do? Say it." "They didn't wipe her memory." Reyes's eyes came up, and there was no laughter in them now, none at all, only the cold, flat certainty of a woman finishing a sentence she had started 11 years ago in a freezing tomb. "And they didn't wipe anything else either, because it never once occurred to any Vol that a lesser creature might read what they left behind. Your boarding crews used command protocols to override the Meridian systems. Handshakes. The little courtesies your ships speak to each other and to the things they conquer so that everything falls into its proper tier and obeys. And the Meridian recorded every one of them, and I have spent 11 years learning to speak them." She drew a breath. "Your ships don't just fold the way I understand, Asuar. They obey the way I understand. I know the handshake a Vol flagship uses to command its own weapons. I've known it for years. I only ever needed to be close enough and loud enough, and to have your full attention on my face instead of on your firewall, which is why I've been talking to you this whole time, and why you've been broadcasting my voice on your own channels, straight into the heart of your own fleet, for the last several minutes." The lance crossed 80%. "You're bluffing," Vale said, "but he said it too fast." "Maybe," Reyes said. "I've only ever tested it in fragments, might not work. You want to bet 11 platforms that it won't." And then, quietly, not to Vale but to her own crew, the way she had said Kesh's name, the way she had rehearsed this 1,000 times in the dark, "Send it." What happened next took less than 2 seconds, and the subject worlds would replay it for 100 years. The perihelion transmitted, not a weapon, not a torpedo, nothing the flagship's defenses were built to stop, because it was not an attack in any form the Vol had ever needed to defend against. It was a command. It was the flagship's own voice. The handshake a Vol ship of the line used to speak to its own spinal lance, reconstructed over 11 years from the dying memory of a hung human ship, and spoken now, perfectly, in the flagship's own language, with the flagship's own authority, at point-blank range with all its firewalls turned outward toward a threat that had already gotten inside by the simple, unforgivable trick of being underestimated. And the sanctity of ordered light, the pride of the Ivory Ascendancy, the flagship of the third tier obeyed. The spinal lance, at 94% of firing charge, with 11 platforms full of human civilians locked in its sights, received a command in a voice it had no reason to doubt, telling it to safe itself and dump its charge. And because the Vol did everything to a rule, and because the deepest rule of all was that a ship obeys the voice of its own command tier, the lance safed itself. The great weapon's glow guttered and died. Its accumulated charge bled harmlessly out into the churned dark, a vast silent flare that lit the trapped crescent from within like distant lightning, and the fuel platform sat untouched at the end of a curve that had suddenly, impossibly, gone to nothing. On the tiered command deck of the sanctity of ordered light, High Executor Ossuar Vale watched his own flagship refuse him, and there is no word in the Vol language, or perhaps in any language, for what moved across the perfect ivory face in that moment. He had spent his entire life inside a structure of absolute obedience, a pyramid of tiers 10,000 years deep, certain to the bottom of his being that command flowed downward and was never ever questioned. And a human, a vagrant, an animal, a disorder, had reached into the very heart of that structure and spoken to his ship in his own voice, and his ship had listened to her instead of him. How, Vale said, it was not really a question, it was the sound a certainty makes when it breaks. I told you at the start, Reyes said, and now, at last, the warmth came back into her voice, though it was a different warmth than the laughter had been, older and quieter and touched with something that might, in a more generous species, have been called pity. I told you you'd already handed me 2 things without meaning to. You handed me a third just now and you never even noticed. You kept saying it over and over like a prayer. The reckoning. The reckoning is announced. The reckoning is proclaimed. Everything the Ascendancy does, it does to a rule, and it does it out loud, and it does it certain that no one beneath you is worth the trouble of studying. That's not your strength, Ossuar. That was never your strength. That's the rope you hung around your own neck 10,000 years ago and called it a crown. She leaned forward. You want to know why I was laughing? Really, it's not because I'd already won. It's because you opened your sentence of death against my whole species by bragging about the one thing you ever did that taught me how to beat you. You showed me the meridian like it was a gallows. My captain, the man who died teaching me in that ship in the cold, one lesson at a time, he told me every jailer's got a rule he doesn't know he's following. He said find it and you'll find the door. I found yours 11 years ago. I've just been waiting for you to walk your whole fleet through it. And then you did. You lined them up in a crescent and read me their sentence, and I couldn't help it, Ossuar. It was funny. After 11 years, it was the funniest thing I ever saw. You brought 40 ships to hang me, and you built the scaffold facing the wrong way. The command deck of the sanctity of ordered light was silent. Around it, the trapped armada hung dark and lamed in the churned dark, 40 cathedrals pinned to the spot, their fold drives cut, their spines blinded, whole and alive and utterly harmless. And every one of them, and the flagship at their center, and the ivory face of the High Executor himself, was being broadcast, live and unstoppable, to a dozen subject worlds that had spent their entire histories believing the Ivory Ascendancy could not be resisted. That was the moment the Empire lost, not when the millstone dropped, not when the fold drives locked or the lance died. The Empire lost in the long silence afterward, when a dozen worlds full of subject peoples looked at their screens and saw, for the first time in 1100 years, an Ascendancy fleet that could not do the one thing an Ascendancy fleet existed to do, held in check by 3 battered ships and a woman who was not afraid of them, who had, in fact, laughed. "You have not destroyed us," Vale said at last. He was gathering himself. Even now, even broken, he was Val, and he reached for the last rule he had, the rule of a defeated commander addressing his conqueror. "You have humiliated us, which is worse and which you will pay for. The conquered will send fleets, 100 fleets. You cannot fight the whole Ascendancy with one dead star and a stolen handshake. You have won an hour. You have not won a war." "No," Reyes agreed. "I haven't. And I'm not going to, and neither are you, and that's exactly what I want to talk about, because here's the part your whole life didn't prepare you for, Aswar." She stood up from the command chair. Finally, at the end, she stood and faced the broken god on the screen. "I'm not going to hang you. I could. Every subject world watching would understand it if I did. I could cut your flagship the way you cut the Meridian and leave you drifting in the dark for 1100 days. An example, a warning, a smooth stone for some other species to carry around in its mouth for a decade. That's the reckoning. That's your instrument. And I'm not going to use it. And I want the whole neighborhood to see me not use it, because that, not the millstone, not the handshake, not any of it, is the thing you never understood about the people you tried to break." She let those words sit, and while they sat, something was happening across a dozen worlds that no one on either side had planned, and that would, in the end, matter more than the millstone or the handshake or any weapon fired that day. On a mining world called Thesset, where a squat, patient people had dug ore for the Ascendancy for 400 years and never once been thanked, a foreman watched the broadcast in a crowded refectory and saw a human captain decline to hang a god, and set down the tool in his hand very slowly, as though it had become a different object. On the ring cities of Alan, where a graceful winged species had lost the right to fly beyond their own atmosphere 3 centuries ago as a condition of surrender, a schoolteacher watched a third-tier flagship refuse its own executor and did not say anything to the children in the room, but she stood a little straighter, and the children noticed, because children always notice. On 7 other worlds, in 7 other ways, subject peoples who had spent their whole lives measuring the exact safe distance between themselves and Ascendancy power watched that distance change on a live feed the Val could not shut off, and began, quietly, privately, each one alone and all of them at once, to do arithmetic of their own. The Ascendancy had ruled by a single, unspoken sum. The cost of defiance is always greater than the cost of obedience. That sum had held for 1100 years because no one had ever been allowed to see it fail. The reckoning existed to keep the sum true, to make defiance so visibly, so instructively catastrophic that no subject people would ever be tempted to run the numbers for themselves. And in one afternoon, on one seized broadcast the executor's own pride had insisted on making galaxy-wide, the sum had been shown to be wrong. Not argued to be wrong. Shown. That was a thing you could not take back. You could destroy the woman who did it. You could send 100 fleets, but you could not reach into a dozen worlds at once and make them unknow the number they had just watched change. High Executor Vale understood this. It was, in fact, the thing he understood most clearly of everything that had happened, because it was the thing his entire life had been built to prevent. And it was why, when one of his own captains tried to salvage the day, he stopped it, not out of mercy, of which he had none, but out of the last cold clarity of a creature who could still see the board even as he lost it. The captain was a young Val of the Crescent's outer wing, a first-tier officer named Sethel Kor, whose fold drive had come back a few seconds ahead of the rest, and who could not bear what he was watching. To sit pinned while a human lectured the precedence was, to him, a wound past enduring, and the moment his drive found its baseline, he brought his ship's remaining battery to bear on the nearest human warship, and he did not ask permission, because in that moment he could not imagine that stopping was the order he would receive. "Executor," Sethel Kor said, his young voice tight with a shame that had nowhere to go, "I have a firing solution. 1 salvo. We take at least one of their ships with us. The precedence should not end this day having given nothing." Let me. You will stand down, Vale said. Executor, they are broadcasting our disgrace too. I know precisely what they are broadcasting, Captain Core, because I am the one who insisted on broadcasting it, and that is a burden I will carry to the conquered myself. Vale's voice had gone flat and absolute. You wish to take one of their ships. Consider what you would purchase. You would purchase, on a live feed to 12 subject worlds, an image of the Ascendancy firing without honor upon an enemy that had spared us after we had already stood down. You would hand that human the one thing she has not yet taken from us, which is the last shred of the claim that our order is better than her mess. You would make her merciful and make us treacherous in front of everyone who has ever feared us forever. That is what your one salvo costs. Stand down your battery, Captain. That is not a request from your executor. It is the only intelligent thing left to do on this entire deck, and I will not watch a first-tier fool undo it. There was a silence on the outer wing, and then Cethel Core's battery went cold, and the young captain, who would remember this day for the rest of a very long Vol life, learned the lesson that Halden Marsh had died teaching from the wrong side of it. That a people who does everything to a rule can be beaten by anyone patient enough to learn the rules, and that the deepest rule of all is the one that says your pride is worth more than your survival, and that this rule, once you finally see it, is the most expensive thing you own. On the perihelion, Reyes had watched the outer wing ship's battery warm and had said nothing, and had not raised her own guns, and her crew had held their breath, because for 4 seconds the whole thing had balanced on the choice of a stranger they would never meet. When the battery went cold, Petro let out a long breath, and Reyes gave the smallest nod, more to herself than to anyone. He stopped his own man, she said quietly. Good, he's still thinking. That's the difference between a war and a slaughter, Petro, whether the loser can still think when it's over. If he'd fired, I'd have had to cut his whole flagship, and the story every world remembers would have been the day the humans destroyed a Vol fleet. This way, it's the day the humans beat one and let it go home. Those aren't the same story. The second one's the one that ends empires. She almost smiled. He just helped me tell it. He doesn't even know he did. She turned back to the screen, to the broken ivory face at the center of a fleet that could not save itself, and to the dozen worlds she knew were still watching, and she understood that everything that remained to be done was not tactics anymore. The tactics had ended when the lance died. What was left was the thing Halden Marsh had spent his last strength trying to teach a frightened girl, the part that came after you'd won, when the losing god still had one hand free, and the whole galaxy was waiting to learn what kind of victor you meant to be. That part could not be planned in 11 years of homework. That part you had to simply be, in the moment, in front of everyone and mean it. So Sable Reyes squared her shoulders and gave herself one breath, and then she told the High Executor of the Ivory Ascendancy exactly what humanity had come all this way to say. Here are the terms, Captain Sable Reyes said, and she said them slowly and clearly, and to the dozen worlds as much as to the executor, because the terms were the point, and the terms were the weapon that would outlast the millstone by 1,000 years. You are going to sit here, all 40 of you, pinned exactly where you arranged yourselves, until the millstone drifts far enough out that your drives can find their feet again. That will take the rest of this rotation. During that time, nobody fires. Not you, not us. You are going to send a full report of what happened here, in your own words, to the Sovereign Conquered, and you are not going to soften it, because I will be broadcasting the truth to every world in range at the same time, and if your version and mine disagree, the whole Ascendancy is going to learn that its third-tier executors lie to their own masters. That will do more damage to your precedents than my cutting lance ever could, and you know it. Vale said nothing. On the tiered deck, the retainers in their graduated whites had gone utterly still, and there was in that stillness the particular quality of subordinates recalculating, for the first time in their lives, which way power actually ran. And here is the part the conquered will have the hardest time with, Reyes continued. When your drives come back, you are going to fold out of the Kesh divide and you are going to leave, and you are going to carry home a message. Not a threat. A fact. The fact is this: humanity is not a disorder at your border. Humanity is the thing that lives comfortably in the mess your kind can't survive in. We came from a filthy, crowded, violent little system, and we never once got to assume the universe would be polite. And that means every place you consider unlivable, ungovernable beneath your notice. The churned systems, the debris fields, the broken places at the edges of your tidy crescents, every one of those places is ours. You cannot fold into them. We can fly through them in our sleep. So you are going to go home and you are going to tell the sovereign conquered the truth, which is that the border between the ascendancy and humanity is not a line you can push. It is a coastline, and we are the sea, and the sea does not submit to the shore. It just waits, and it is very, very patient. And if the conquered sends 100 fleets anyway, Vale said. He had found his voice again, but it was a different voice, stripped of its old cool certainty, and everyone watching heard the change. Then 100 fleets will chase us into places they can't follow, and will drop 100 millstones and cut 100 fold drives and hand 100 executors the same broadcast I'm handing you, Reyes said. Do the arithmetic, Oswar. You're good at it. It's how you survived your own tears. Every time you come, you lose ships you can't fight in the places we live, in front of the subject worlds you rule by fear. And fear is a candle. It burns bright and it burns fast, and the moment a single world sees it flicker, the moment a dozen worlds watch a third-tier executor's own flagship refuse him and a human decline to hang him when she easily could, the candle's already going out. You didn't lose 40 ships today. 40 ships you can replace. You lost the dark. You lost the thing that made the reckoning work, which was that nobody had ever seen it fail. They've seen it now. They're going to keep seeing it. And you cannot unsee a thing for a dozen worlds at once. There was a long silence, and in it, the millstone drifted on its slow, lazy orbit, and the churned space around the armada slowly began to smooth, and 40 fold drives crept by degrees back toward the baseline they needed, exactly as Reyes had said they would, on exactly the schedule she had promised, because she knew their drives better than they did. When High Executor Oswar Vale spoke again, it was not to Reyes. It was to his own weapons master, in the graduated white of the second tier, and the order he gave was the last order of a reckoning that had failed, the rule for when there was no rule left but survival. Stand down all batteries, Vale said. Compose the report. The full report. A pause, and then, in a voice so low the translation matrix nearly lost it, accurate. And on a dozen subject worlds, peoples who had knelt for 1100 years watched an Ivory Ascendancy fleet stand down its guns at the word of a human, and something that had been frozen inside them for a very long time began, quietly, to thaw. The rotation passed. It passed slowly, and it passed without a single further shot, and it was in its way the most extraordinary part of the whole affair, because for the length of an entire local rotation, the greatest armada the Ascendancy had ever fielded sat pinned and dark and obedient, while 3 battered human warships kept watch over it and tended their own dead. It was during that long, strange rotation that the true cost of the day settled onto everyone who had lived it. On the human platforms, the civilian workers who had spent 90 seconds staring down a spinal lance came out onto their observation decks and simply looked at the trapped white giants, saying very little, the way people are quiet at the edge of a thing too large to speak about. On the hospital tender, a surgeon who had been prepping her patients for the end unpicked those preparations one bandage at a time, her hands unsteady now that the danger was past in the way hands often are, having held steady all through the danger itself. And on the bridge of the perihelion, Reyes read the casualty logs in full, not just the tally, but the names, everyone, because she had promised herself long ago that she would never let the dead become a number the way the Val had made her whole crew a number on a warning beacon. 9 names from the ardent Kesh. 2 more from the perihelion's own forward battery, where a Vol point defense round had breached the hull during the run. 11 people who had been alive that morning and would not fold home. She read each name aloud quietly to the bridge, and the bridge stood for each one, and no one told her it was sentimental, because they all understood it was the exact opposite of sentiment. It was the thing they were fighting for. It was the whole difference. Word of what had happened traveled faster than any ship could carry it. Long before the rotation ended, the broadcast Vale's pride had insisted on had been copied and recopied and flung down 1,000 relay chains, and it arrived on worlds so far from the Kesh divide that their peoples had never seen a human, and it arrived carrying with it the one image the Ascendancy had spent 1,100 years making certain no one would ever see. A fleet of the Precedents, pinned and dark, and a small gray captain declining to hang it. That image did not start a rebellion. Rebellions take longer and cost more, and are not begun by a single afternoon. But it planted something in the ground of a dozen worlds and 100 more beyond them, a small hard seed of an idea that had been forbidden for 11 centuries, that the sum could come out differently, that the dark could be beaten, that somewhere out in the churned and broken places the Ascendancy would not go, there were people who had beaten it and had laughed while they did. They recovered what they could of the ardent Kesh. There was not much. Imara Kesh and her 9 had bought the platforms their lives with their own, and Reyes made certain, on the open broadcast, that every world watching knew their names, because the Vol made examples of the defiant and Reyes had decided long ago that humans would make examples of the brave instead, and that the difference between those two things was the whole difference between the Ascendancy and everything she wanted her species to be. When the fold drives came back, when the last of the millstones churned smoothed out of the local space, and 40 drives found their footing at almost the same moment, the Ivory Ascendancy did not attack. It could have. For perhaps 90 seconds before the human ships could react, the Armada had its power back and its guns were still warm, and a different executor in a different story might have thrown everything into one last spiteful salvo. But the whole galaxy was watching, and the report had already gone to the conquered in Vale's own accurate words, and Ossuar Vale was, whatever else he was, not a fool. He had read the same display as Reyes. He knew that the only thing worse than losing a fleet on a live broadcast was losing it twice. The sanctity of ordered light folded out first, and the 39 ships of the Crescent followed it, one by one, their ceramic white hulls slipping out of the murdered starlight and back into the smooth, clean space they had come from, until the sky above the amber gas giant held nothing but the stars again, and the ordinary battered traffic of a frontier crossing, and 3 human warships that had, that day, changed the shape of the galaxy without firing on a single unarmed thing. Reyes stayed in the command chair a long time after they left. Her crew let her. They understood, in the way crews understand these things without being told, that their captain had just finished something that had begun 11 years ago in a cold, dark tomb, and that a person needs a moment, after a thing like that, to feel the weight of it come off. It was young Petro, the navigator, who finally spoke, because he could not help himself, because he was 20 and he had just watched his captain do something that would be told and retold until the sun went cold, and he needed to understand the one part of it that still didn't fit. "Captain," he said, "the laughing at the start, when he read out the sentence, you said it wasn't because you'd already won." He hesitated. "Was it really funny, genuinely? With all of it, with the Meridian, with what they did to you, with everything you lost, was it actually funny?" Sable Reyes was quiet for a moment. On the forward screen, the frontier crossing had already begun to return to its ordinary life. The barges were moving again. The hospital tender was signaling its thanks. The fuel platforms were lighting their lamps against the coming night. She thought about a broad, weathered man with enormous scarred hands who had spent his last strength teaching a frightened girl to read a clock, who had told her, in a freezing dark, that every jailer had a rule he didn't know he was following, And that laughter, real laughter, was the sound a free person made that a jailer could never make and could never take away. Halden used to say the Vol couldn't laugh, she said at last. Bred it out of themselves, called it a disorder of the lower tiers. And he said that was the whole thing about them, Petro, that was the tell. Because you can only laugh at something if you're standing above it, if you're not afraid of it, if you can see the shape of the whole thing at once and find the part of it that's absurd. She smiled, tired and real. For 11 years I've known this day was coming. I've known how it would go. And the one thing I could never be sure of, the one thing I couldn't plan, was whether I'd still be afraid when it actually came. Whether they'd still be the gods that hung my ship in the dark, or whether they'd finally just be 40 machines lined up in a crescent, doing exactly what a decade of homework said they'd do. She let out a slow breath. And then he opened his mouth and he bragged about the meridian, and he lined them up in the crescent, and every single thing happened exactly the way the dead man in the tomb said it would. And I wasn't afraid. That was the moment I found out I wasn't afraid anymore, Petro. Right there in front of 40 ships. So yes. Her smile widened, and for just a second the girl she had been showed through the woman she'd become, cut down from the dark and grown up hard around a coal she'd carried 11 years. It was funny. It was the funniest thing I ever saw. They spent 10,000 years making themselves too proud to laugh, and they never once understood that the day a smaller creature stands over you and laughs, really laughs, easy and unafraid, because it can finally see the whole shape of you and every piece of it is absurd. That's the day your empire's already over. They just haven't heard the punchline yet. She stood and stretched, and looked at the ordinary stars where 40 dreadnoughts had hung an hour before. Signal the fleet, she said. Log the dead. Send Kesh's names to every world that was watching, and then set us a course for the next churned, broken, ungovernable little corner of space the Ascendancy thinks is beneath them. The scar at the corner of her mouth crooked upward one last time. Because the sea doesn't submit to the shore, Petro, it just waits, and I intend to be very, very patient. The perihelion came about, and lit her drives, and slipped away into the mess that only humans could fly, leaving behind a frontier that had been going to fall that morning and had not, and a dozen watching worlds that would never again quite believe the dark could not be beaten. And somewhere in the smooth, clean space of the Ascendancy, a broken god folded home carrying a report he could not soften, and the sound of a young woman's laughter that 10,000 years of pride had left him with no way to answer at all.